And let's face it, there are more than enough pharaohs in our time. There are powerful people who are willing to carry out atrocities in the name of some supposedly righteous cause. And here it's important to remind ourselves that God will bring his good promise to fruition, even when human sinfulness seems to threaten that promise. To truly believe this is to have Christian hope. One piece of advice that I would give to anyone who is new to the parenting game is this: never make a promise to your child that you suspect you might not be able to keep in the future, later on down the road. Because if you do make that promise and then you fail to follow through with it later, your kid is undoubtedly going to become outraged, really upset. And then for the next 5 or 6 hours, you're going to have to listen to, but you promised to take me to the mall, but you promised to buy that toy, but you promised to go get us dinner tonight, something like that. And kids aren't just like that. Adults are like that as well, right? We're in election time, I guess, here in New Brunswick. Definitely they're ramping up in the United States for election. A lot of people are cynical about politics right now. Why? Because so many times in the past, our leaders, or people at least running for office, have made promises during the heat of election fever, and then later on they don't quite follow through with what they promised they would do when they were campaigning. The point is this, we rightfully expect a promise to be kept. We rightfully expect a promise to be kept. After all, that's what a promise is. A promise is a faithful commitment to do something that we said we would do. Now the question is this: is God faithful to the promises that he makes? Now you're hearing this sermon in a church, of course. You're hearing me ask this question in a church, so I think you can expect the answer to that question to be yes. And it is. And I think that that's the response that comes clearly from our story from the book of Exodus today. God will bring his covenant promise to fruition. And here's the thing: even when human sinfulness and the plots and schemes of wicked people seems to place that promise in grave danger, God will come through. I'll repeat that because it's so important. God will be faithful to his promise even when human sinfulness, the sins of others, and our own sins seem to get in the way of that promise's fulfillment. So, let's take a closer look at that story from Exodus chapter 1 and 2. This story, very familiar story that no doubt you have heard since you were in Sunday school. So, in our Old Testament reading today, we learn that the Jewish people at the time were living as foreigners in Egypt, and their numbers were growing quite spectacularly. As a people, they were becoming very numerous, they were becoming very strong. And this rapid growth of the Hebrew population actually is the fulfillment of a promise. It's a fulfillment of a promise that God made to Father Abraham and to Sarah, to Isaac and to Jacob. It's a promise that he made to the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people, namely that they would be the fathers, the mothers of this great and mighty nation. And of course, you remember the story of how the Lord asked Abraham to look into the sky and to try to count the number of stars. And he said, "You will have as many descendants as these." And now that the people of Israel are in Egypt, those numbers are increasing. That promise is being fulfilled. That was God's promise fulfilled. In fact, the author of Exodus writes, "The Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them." Now, I want you to bear in mind that at the time, again, the people of Israel were living as foreigners in the land of Egypt. And when Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, sees how numerous the Hebrew population has become, he actually starts getting nervous. And so he says to the officials, "Look, there are way too many Israelites for us to handle right now. We've got to do something. So let's devise a plan to contain them just in case, let's say, a war breaks out. they could potentially join the side of our enemies and fight against us. We don't trust them. And I want you to notice that what Pharaoh is doing here isn't exactly foreign to human nature, of course. Like, we often use alleged threats to our country, alleged threats to our family, alleged threats to our own personal lives to justify us acting in ways that are often cruel and immoral. So the first thing Pharaoh decides to do is make the Israelites into a population of slave laborers. And in this way, he could keep them under his thumb and he can curb the prolific growth of their population. The Bible tells us that the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of labor. Okay? I want you to take note what's going on here. The sinful actions of Pharaoh are threatening God's promise to Abraham, to make his people a numerous nation. But for all the oppression that Pharaoh dishes out, the Hebrew population, we learn in the story, continues to grow. It continues to multiply. It continues to spread. It's like God's promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is unstoppable. So what does Pharaoh do? Well, he resorts to plan B. He instructs the Hebrew midwives to kill all the baby boys that are born to Hebrew mothers. And Pharaoh hopes that in killing off an entire generation of males, not only can he prevent the Israelite population from growing, but he could also eliminate the possibility of the Israelites forming an army of their own. So fortunately, what happens in the story? Well, apparently the midwives fear God. They can't bring themselves to just follow orders. They resist. And instead, they kind of use subterfuge. They make an excuse. They say the Hebrew women aren't like the Egyptian women. Before we can get there, they've already had their baby. And so Pharaoh's plan B has failed. And the population of Israel continues to grow. The Hebrews continue to multiply and spread in Egypt. So finally, Pharaoh launches plan C. And he issues a direct order, not just to the midwives, but to everyone in Egypt. Throwing off the cloak of secrecy, he decrees that from now on, all male babies born to Hebrew women are to be killed as soon as they're born. That's an order that everyone is supposed to fulfill, whether Hebrew or Egyptian. And at this point, things start looking really bleak for the Israelites. Will God's promise be fulfilled? Will it be kept? Now, at this point in the story, there's a bit of a shift in focus. So, from the beginning of the story until now, the focus has been on Pharaoh, the grand affairs of the Egyptian court. But now, the scene shifts to this humble Hebrew family. The mother and father aren't mentioned by name yet. All we know is that they were from the tribe of Levi. We're told that the mother has just given birth to a beautiful and healthy baby boy. And of course, like all mothers, like any sensible mother or person, she can't bring herself to kill this baby. So she begins to raise the baby. She raises him until it becomes very difficult to keep this child a secret. And then, in desperation perhaps, she places the baby in a basket that's made out of river reeds. She waterproofs it with tar and pitch. Then she takes that basket, she puts it in the waters of the Nile River, and the Nile takes the baby away from her. Of course, we all know this is not an ordinary baby that's drifting down the Nile River at this point. This baby, of course, would later be named Moses, and Moses will one day become this great leader for the people of Israel. God will literally pluck him out, he will lift him out and select him as the one who will lead the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt and into the land God promised to give to Abraham. Right? So there's a lot more in this basket than just a little baby boy. God's promise is in this basket. God's promise to Abraham, God's promises to Israel, they're all floating down the Nile in this frail basket. of dry reeds. Therefore, God carefully guides this basket down the current. His eyes are on its infinitely precious cargo, and finally he brings it to, of all people, the daughter of Pharaoh, the princess, who just happens to be bathing in the Nile. She discovers the basket, she opens it up, she discovers, of course, that it's a baby, and immediately her heart goes out to this little helpless creature. This must be one of the Hebrew babies, she thinks to herself, and like the midwives, she can't follow the orders of her father. She can't kill this baby, she can't take it and drown it in the waters of the Nile. So instead, she has the baby nursed by his very own mother, and then takes the child back and raises that child on her own, presumably in the court of Pharaoh. Despite the wicked plans of Pharaoh, God ensures that his chosen servant Moses lives. And because Moses lives, God's promise to Israel can be fulfilled. And again, that brings us back to the idea that I think is at the heart of this story from Exodus, this story of Moses' birth. And the idea is God will bring his covenant promise to fruition, again, even when the plots and schemes of men like Pharaoh and the sinfulness of the human heart seem to place that promise in grave danger. And I think this message is just as relevant to us today as it was to the people of Israel 3,000 years ago when this story was first set. It's just as relevant today as it was back in Jesus' time when the Jews gathered together in synagogue to hear this story being read in their own Torah. And I'll put it this way. Like the people of Israel, we too look forward to the fulfillment of God's promise to us. So that raises the question, what specifically is God's promise to us? Well, God has promised to redeem his creation. God has promised to make his creation whole again, to make things right. And right now, it doesn't exactly seem like the world around us is perfect. And all you have to do is just switch on your computer, turn on your TV, open up a newspaper. And the reality that we're seeing right now is, well, definitely sickness, but also poverty, racial division, class warfare. St. Paul said something to the effect that the world is groaning in labor pains, and I think you can almost sense that groaning, particularly at a time like this. But the Christian hope is that one day this same creation that we see groaning in labor pains will be redeemed. Now, what this new age, this redeemed world might look like, I couldn't begin to describe. The Bible paints sketches of it all throughout the words of the prophets and well into the New Testament. Tries to give us an impression of what a redeemed creation might look like. And it's important that we not take these too literally, because realistically, what it's actually going to be like, I think, is beyond our present comprehension, beyond our ability to grasp at this time. But Isaiah says, hinting at what this world might look like, he says, "The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain." The prophet Isaiah says that in this new age, men will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And finally, the author of Revelation, and this is, I think, the most beautiful of all the images, describes God's redeemed creation as this great city. He calls it the New Jerusalem. And in this city, he says there's no temple. That sounds strange. This is supposed to be the New Jerusalem. You know, God's creation perfected, and there's no temple, there's no place to worship God. Well, why? Well, because God's presence is everywhere. It fills everyone. It fills everything. There's no need for a place to go and worship the Lord, because he'll be everywhere. You know, God's heaven, God's New Jerusalem will descend to the earth. All of creation will be healed and renewed. And sometimes I think we Christians fall into this very unbiblical assumption that one day God is destined to destroy all of creation in his wrath. Right? But that just isn't true. That doesn't square with my reading of the scriptures. The true biblical hope is that God cares enough about the world to one day redeem it, to make it whole again. That's his promise. And as we Christians, we believe that promise is going to be fulfilled. But sometimes the fulfillment of that promise seems so unlikely, and we sometimes lose faith that it's ever going to happen, that we will ever see this. We don't long for it. We don't hope for it. We don't pray for it. And I'll give you an example of how this is true from my own life. I believe that part of God's new creation will be a redeemed and reconciled church. So instead of having the body of Christ fragmented and divided into Protestant and Roman Catholic and Orthodox, we would be one in him somehow. And there are prayers that we say in the Book of Common Prayer, and I use the BCP every morning for my devotions. There are prayers there for the unity of the church. And there have been times when I've so despaired in the hope of unity in the church that I haven't been able to bring myself to pray them. And so I've kind of made it a discipline, a spiritual discipline, to say those prayers whether I feel like it or not, to keep that hope alive in me, if you know what I mean. And it doesn't just apply to unity in the church, it applies to all sorts of things. Maybe we've given up faith in the idea of God redeeming creation. Because we look around us and it doesn't seem like the world is heading to a state of perfection and glory. Instead, we see human sinfulness, ravaging communities, ravaging the planet. And let's face it, there are more than enough pharaohs in our time. There are powerful people who are willing to carry out atrocities in the name of some supposedly righteous cause. And here it's important to remind ourselves that God will bring his good promise to fruition, even when human sinfulness seems to threaten that promise. To truly believe this is to have Christian hope, true Christian hope. As Christians, we need to have hope that we live in a world that is being guided and directed towards a good purpose by a loving God. That has to be the lens through which we see the world and through which we see history. Because I'll tell you what the alternative is. The alternative is hopelessness and despair. The alternative is to see the world as random and meaningless. But I don't believe in a world that is like this, because I believe in a God who keeps his promises out of his love for us, even when in our sinfulness we rebel against him, and even when we as human beings seem to be doing things that constantly jeopardize that promise. One more thing I want to say about this story from the book of Exodus. I think this story from Exodus encourages us to look for specific, concrete signs of hope in a world that seems to be totally dominated by the power of sin. Now, one sign of hope from today's reading was the fact that, despite all of Pharaoh's shrewd plans, the people of Israel continue to grow and multiply and spread in keeping with God's promise. And I'd like to suggest to you that as members of Christ's church, we are God's people today. And just as Israel's growth was a sign of hope in their age, I believe that the growth of the church and the good works of the church in our time are signs of hope right here in our age in the 21st century. Yes, believe it or not, the church actually is growing. It may not look like that from St. John, New Brunswick, or from most parts of North America and Western Europe, but the church actually is growing spectacularly. In countries like Kenya and Uganda, for example, the Anglican Church in particular is very much alive and well. It's filled with vitality and life. And not only are we growing, but as Anglicans, but you're seeing the church spread exponentially in places like China, for example. There are incredible renewal movements going on in the world today that I think are signs that God is being faithful to his promise. Disciples of Jesus are multiplying and spreading. And the church in many parts of the world, too, like we're doing work that brings glory to the Father and hope to all people. We're building hospitals, digging wells, opening schools, preaching the gospel. We're welcoming refugees. Now, this isn't to say that non-Christians aren't doing anything like this. In today's reading, we have Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter isn't a Hebrew. She's not a member of God's chosen people. But she acts compassionately to save the life of baby Moses. And so too, in our age, there are non-Christians who have committed themselves to good deeds, to works of compassion, to works of mercy, to works that have honored and glorified Jesus. And I think they too are signs of hope, and we can look at them and not despair because of what they're doing. So what do we hope for? Well, we hope that one day God will redeem all creation and he will usher in his glorious kingdom. And at times, it seems like this plan is threatened by the seemingly overwhelming power of human sin. At times, it seems like this promise is being threatened by men like Pharaoh. But today's reading is a reminder to us God will bring his covenant promise to fruition even when human sinfulness seems to place that promise in grave danger.